So, meine Damen und Herren, ich hoffe, Sie sind hinreichend beeindruckt. Einen wunderschönen guten Abend. Ja, das war doch wohl stark, oder? Dafür, dass wir uns hier mit eigentlich ernsten Angelegenheiten beschäftigen, weil, das kann ich Ihnen schon sicher sagen, es wird ein bisschen ernster, aber natürlich nicht nur, selbstverständlich. Wie schön, dass Sie alle da sind. Mein Name ist Jörg Thaddeus. Ich darf Sie durch dieses Programm führen und Sie sind ein spektakuläres Publikum, weil als ich das gerade hier so gesehen habe, habe ich gedacht, Sie sind wahrscheinlich für jemanden, der bei Massenmedien arbeitet, das klügste Publikum, was ich mindestens in diesem Jahr erlebt habe. Ich glaube, außer mir hat keiner hier im Raum sein Studium abgebrochen. Oder? Deswegen habe ich, es möchte sich keiner melden. Da hinten sehe ich so einen Raunen. Deswegen habe ich Ihnen natürlich passenderweise, um Ihnen klarzumachen, dass Sie alles falsch gemacht haben, im Leben ein Fußballer-Zitat mitgebracht, wie sich das gehört, in dieser Stadt, in der wieder auf internationalem Niveau Fußball gespielt wird, außerhalb der Fußballweltmeisterschaft, Eintracht Frankfurt. Deswegen sind wir nicht hier, sondern wir sind wegen der Finanzen und der Wirtschaft hier. Aber das tolle Zitat, was Ihnen sagt, wir hätten nicht zu Ende studieren müssen, ist von Christoph Daum. Der hat 2013 die SGE, also Eintracht Frankfurt, trainiert und hat gesagt, wenn der Kopf richtig funktioniert,
and he said, if your head or if your brain works well, then it's your third leg. So please take it to heart.
Damit haben wir das schrägste Bild hoffentlich des heutigen Abends hinter uns.
So let's move on to some more serious topics. I will be your host today. I'm not an expert like the ladies and gentlemen that will be on stage today. However, I'm a really big fan, just like many other people, because, for example, if you have a look at the numbers around biodiversity, then as a non-expert, you think this cannot be true, it cannot stay like this, we need to change it. And the people that are very important in the city need to make sure we change. And I had a phone call earlier with a very important person here in Frankfurt, and he said he has a feeling that economy acts outside of nature. However, we will talk about this today more with some experts, with the State Secretary Stark-Watzinger. There will be a rather weird situation because I, as a German, will talk in English with a German minister. So let's see how that will work. But first of all, let me tell you something more about this great house and the two great men that have won a lot of awards already. You have seen this is a great house with a great team that also has a great boss. So please welcome the General Director of the Senckenberg-Leibniz Institute for Biodiversity and Earth System Research, Mr. Clement Trockner, and the Director of Frankfurt Zoological Society, Christoph Schenk. So please give them a warm welcome. I read up, Mr. Trockner, that biodiversity is not a very precise term, and therefore I'm asking you now, what is biodiversity? Thank you very much and welcome to all of you here at Senckenberg. Biodiversity is the diversity of ecosystems, genetic variations. It's a result of more than 3.5 billion years of natural evolution. This is our central basis for life. It's what our well-being is based on. And at the same time, the decline of biodiversity is the biggest challenge that we are facing. Well, on the one hand, if something is lost, it's usually lost forever, and on the other hand, we don't know what losing 20 or 30% of this biodiversity will mean for nature and for us human beings. And if you don't know what the consequences are, then we need to be extra careful. This is the basic and the central job of politicians to make sure that also future generations are going to have a good life. Christoph, what's the status quo of biodiversity? Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, the status quo is very bad. We are in the midst of the sixth mass addiction. In the past, this was due to volcanoes, for example, but however, this mass extinction is the first one that is caused by Homo sapiens. Around 1 million plants and animal species are endangered, and we are losing a lot of them every single day. And just think about it, even today, we are losing species that have developed over hundreds, thousands or millions of years, and extinction is a one-way street. There's no way back. Maybe you know the study from 2017 that was conducted here in Germany, and it says that in 20 or 30 years, the amount of insects has gone down by 75%, even though we know that 2/3 of our nutritionist plants need these animals, these insects. Nowadays, we know that by losing biodiversity and by having this mass extinction, we won't be able to achieve the main goals of our humanity. We won't be able to achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, anymore. 80% of the goals, which also include very important goals such as education, fight against poverty, and so on, won't be able to be achieved if we cannot stop the reduction of biodiversity on our planet. The same also goes for climate goals and a lot of other goals. Today we know that if we protect areas, such as, for example, 30% of the Earth's surface, we can save 500 gigatons, and that's a massive amount. So this is a very dramatic situation, Clement, I have to admit. And it's a situation that we haven't seen before on this planet. Clement, maybe you can explain how biodiversity and climate are related. The crisis of biodiversity and the climate crisis are closely related to human beings. I would like to explain this to you a bit. First of all, the heating up of our planet will be a decisive factor, but also pollution. Furthermore, we won't be able to achieve the 1.5-degree goal if we don't invest into the last remaining ecosystems and if we don't renaturize the systems that have already been lost. And thirdly, one-sided measures for climate protection can have dramatic effects for biodiversity, which means that our rivers and lakes, for example, are the biggest losers of the Paris Climate Agreement, because we have to see that hydropower is not a positive thing for biodiversity. Christoph, are there positive examples that we can have a look at? Yes, thankfully there are. We know that on 20% of the Earth's surface, we can find 80% of all the species. Therefore, we need to concentrate on the treasure areas of biodiversity, which mainly can be found in the tropics. I was at the Altrepos National Park at the border of Peru and Brazil. It's a very far away area. And I also was in a national park in the north of Zambia. Those are great and immense natural parks. For example, one of them is 10 times the size of all the natural parks that we have in Germany, and they contain a lot of species. They have great rivers, as we don't know them anymore, endless forests, and both of the parks have very characteristic animal species, such as rhinoceros for the one in Africa, and the one in Peru also has very characteristic animals that only live there. It is also a very big success that it is possible to work together with indigenous people who live in the area, and they are happy to cooperate with the NGOs and the governments in the area. This gives hope for us, makes us hopeful for the future. Also the example of Tanzania, that has already created 22 natural parks, and if we combine this with game-controlled areas and so on, then they have already protected almost 30% of their country's surface, and this is exactly the amount of surface that we need to protect in order to keep our biodiversity. So there are good examples. There are countries that are going forward, but we need to get active. We need to help the global south, because the global north has caused a lot of damage by using fossil energy and overusage of resources all over the world, and now we have to pay our dues. This would also be very sensible, because we would also benefit from it, as we would have a world that would be more ecological and fairer. Clement, when we have a look at all of these rather daunting figures, do you still have hope? Yes, I still do have hope, otherwise I wouldn't be here today. We can do this. Mankind has become the decisive power, and we are innovative, and our innovativeness has to lead us out of the situation. It is clear, the longer we wait, the more difficult it will become. We need to achieve this transition, because the longer we wait, the more it is likely that this era of man will be the shortest there will ever have been in the history of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, we are optimists by profession. This is the only way to go forward. And we also are a generation of responsibility. This is the first time that these two factors have come together in one generation. On the one hand, the big destruction of our ecosystems. On the other hand, the possibility to remedy all of that again. We are on the cusp of the conference of the parties to the Convention of Biological Diversity. And, well, all the 14 conferences before didn't have the results that we wanted to have. And now we will have COP15. And so far we haven't achieved our goals yet. So this is a failure of politics and markets on country, EU and on global level, and therefore we need to make sure that we want to achieve very ambitious goals, such as this protection goal of 30%. We also need mechanisms that make sure that these areas are actually protected. The German federal government started a program 2 years ago, which is called Legacy Landscape, and this was the first step into the endless financing of protected areas. So this is a very big step. It's a good instrument. It still needs to grow much stronger, but it's a beginning, and I believe all of that gives us hope. And I hope that we will keep being hopeful when we are in Montreal at the conference. So, what do you think? What are your expectations of our conference here today? We need the cooperation between civil society, politics, and also economics. That's why we're here today with a focus on companies, and I believe this will be a very great and interesting evening. And while I'm here, I would like to thank the great team that has worked very hard over the past few weeks. And now I would like to open this conference. Thank you, Mr. Tockner. Thank you, Mr. Schenk. Now we want to connect with the economy, and hopefully we will have a connection with someone who has a lot of knowledge in politics. She used to be the Ministry of Defense of France. Now she works at Banque de France. It should be Ms. Goulart. Can you hear me? Good evening.
Or Eurovision Song Contest.
It's a bit like the Eurovision
Good
Song
evening,
Contest.
Madame Goulart.
Good evening, Madame
Ja, können Sie mich hören?
Ausgezeichnet. Gut, dass ich Sie in merkwürdigen Sprachen angesprochen habe. Schön, dass Sie bei uns sind. Hier ist Ihr Applaus.
Thank you for being here. This is your applause in Frankfurt.
Vielen, vielen Dank. Also ich bin da, ob mein PowerPoint
Thank you very much. I'm here. Let's hope that my PowerPoint presentation is also present.
Aber das ist nicht schlimm, sonst fange ich an und wenn Sie mir es erlauben,
that doesn't really matter. I can start anyway, and I will speak in English.
Well, as Mr. Tockner said, we really need to work all together. So the first slide I wanted to present is the need for the financial sector and the economy to acknowledge biodiversity loss, a phenomena which is happening, and I say hello to Christoph Schenk, with whom I did a debate recently. And so the scientists know that there is biodiversity loss and that there are nature-related risks. But to a certain extent, the perception of the risks for nature is not, the awareness is not as large in the public opinion and in the medias and in the economic and financial world than on climate. So climate is only the tip of the iceberg, and we know that there are multiple and interconnected ecological crises linked to climate change, biodiversity loss, land system change. There is normally a nice chart from the Stockholm Residence Center, which shows that there are planetary boundaries. We are acting, producing, consuming, living in a planet which is limited. And sometimes we don't realize. And Rockström and then the Potsdam Institute on Climate did a lot of work on this. The IPBS, which is a little bit the IPCC for biodiversity, also underlined, keep only this message. I'm sorry not to have the slides, but it is that our resources are limited. It is true for water, it is true for oceans, it is true for climate and biodiversity in general. In his wonderful review on this issue, Professor Dasgupta, who is an emeritus professor in Cambridge, did a work in 2021 for Her Majesty's Treasury at that time on the global economy in the Anthropocene. And in this fantastic document, he insists on the fact that we are embedded in nature and that we are entering a new era of human-made risks, it was said before in the presentation, called the Anthropocene. So the second slide was, once you have set the framework with the scientists, what can central banks, what can finance do? What we try to do, and we are very modest, and I insist on this point, we should all be very humble. These are complex issues, and to calculate the financial risks linked to this phenomenon is quite difficult. But we published at the Banque de France in August 2021 a paper called A Silent Spring, exploring biodiversity-related financial risks in France. We worked with others, with the French KFV, the Caisse des Dépôts, with the French Office on Biodiversity and with the French MDB AFD. And we tried to measure the static assessment of dependencies from nature and impact on nature of the French financial system. This work, and I could move to the next slide if I would have one, shows that, and you can just keep these figures in mind, that the French economy dependence to ecosystem is more or less 42% of the value of securities in portfolios that are issued by firms that are highly or very highly dependent on at least one ecosystem service, which means use of water, pollination, timber, etc., etc. So we are more dependent than we thought from nature in our economic activities. It is true for agriculture, but it is also true for other types of production. So 42% in France. Some studies made more recently by Malaysia or Brazil reach more or less the same levels of dependence. So it's not 2 or 3%, it's around 40–45% of the economy. And we tried also to measure the impact of human activity, economic activity, on nature. And in this direction, the impact, we calculated more or less that already 24% of the surface of the area of the surface of French metropolitan, let's leave apart the overseas territories, are already artificialized, 24%. So 42% the dependency from nature and 24% the impact through artificialization, the loss of natural space. So we are absolutely convinced that the level of dependence and impact requires that financial and non-financial sector become aware and fight against biodiversity loss. So what we have tried to do, we have created some years ago, December 2017 at the One Planet Summit, we were with the Bundesbank, but also with the Chinese central bank, the Moroccan, the Mexican. So worldwide, 8 central banks decided to create a network called the Network for Greening the Financial System, NGFS. We created this network in order to exchange good practices, study the phenomenon linked with climate and environmental damages, in order to see the financial implication. And we stated in 2019 that climate-related financial risks are climate-related risks are financial risks, physical, because of severe events, or because of the need for our society to move toward net zero. And some industries, I don't need to underline this in Germany, like chemicals or cars, need to adapt. So we stated in 2019 that there is a financial impact of climate change and transition. And in 2022, in March, we adopted a statement at the NGFS, where we have now more than 120 central banks and supervisors, that nature-related risks, including those associated with biodiversity loss, could have significant macroeconomic implications, and failure to account for, mitigate, and adapt to this implication is a source of risk for individual financial institutions as well as for financial stability. So there is a climate biodiversity nexus, but there is also a risk which is specifically linked with the destruction of nature. And in March 2022, for the one interested, we published a very first report with a network called INSPIRE of scientists on central banking and supervision in the biosphere. In April, we launched a task force on nature that I have the privilege to co-chair with a colleague from the Dutch National Bank, Saskia de Vries. And I must say that in Germany, you have Sabine Mauderer, who is the vice chair of the NGFS, who is very active as well. So we launched this task force. We try to have a mapping of existing work on the link between nature loss and finance. We try to elaborate a conceptual framework, which is already clearly developed in the report with Inspired I just mentioned, and we explore the development of scenarios, because as you know, in macroeconomy, you need scenarios to envisage the future, and these scenarios could be also used to organize stress tests to see what is the resilience of the banking system, for example, or the insurance companies. We are not the only one. I want to pay tribute to a report of the Dutch Central Bank indebted to nature, to the Bank of Malaysia, who did a report with the World Bank, and to the Bank of Brazil. And all these countries are very active in our network, fortunately, because it is important to have countries from the north and from the south. Christoph Schenk underlined the necessity to look at the global aspect. So I conclude with my last non-existing slide, which is the need for a mobilization going beyond central banks. Once again, we try to take our responsibilities. We know that we can have an impact on the financial sector at large, but of course we need action from governments. They are democratically elected. They have the accountability, and they have also tools we don't have, like incentives, tax, prohibitions, and all measures they can adopt. And we hope that the COP15 in Montreal in December will bring a breakthrough, even if it's not easy in the current geopolitical context. But we absolutely need some progress from the side of governments. We also need initiative from the private sector. I just mentioned one, the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which is co-chaired by Elisabeth Moema, the chair of the CDB, and David Craig, former boss of Refinitiv. And they want to publish a disclosure framework to help companies to realize how important it is to have data, to exploit them, to look at the strategy of the company, to have the right governance, the right risk management, the right metrics. And their model, their template is the TCFD, the work done by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which published a report some years ago. So we need everybody on board. As I said at the beginning, we need the scientists. We try to do our best, but we need also, of course, the governments, the private sector, and my last word for all NGOs and citizens very much engaged in the civil society. Without their pressure on all of us, we would probably be less motivated and efficient, even if we are, but they need to continue. So I was very, very glad to speak with you tonight. In my PowerPoint, I hope you can maybe put it on your website. There is also a bibliography for the ones interested in these reports, because it's difficult to tackle complex issues in a very, very short time. But I was glad that I had this opportunity. Thank you very much. Und vielen Dank.
Why does biodiversity matter? Every breath we take, every meal we eat, much of what happens in our global economy, in our daily lives, is dependent on ecosystems and biodiversity. Indeed, in the way that we look at the diversity of life on the planet, it is not just a matter of the phenomena of evolution, it's how these different elements interact with one another. And we as humans in the age of the Anthropocene have become one of the greatest disruptors of this extraordinary wealth that supports life on Earth.
Nature provides us with the resilience that protects us from future shocks and stresses. Nature buffers everything from floods, droughts, disease, heat waves. The latest science even shows that if we did not have living species and ecosystems, we would have crossed the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit already today. Wetlands, forests, natural ecosystems absorb approximately 50% of all the emission of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel burning. This is the largest subsidy to the world economy.
If we've learned one thing from the climate crisis, it is that simple appeals to do better are simply not enough. Not when our global economic system rewards harm to the environment. And therefore, just as we're trying to incorporate climate as a vital global public good in our financial system by curbing and taxing those activities that harm it and incentivizing and subsidizing those that protect it, we need to do the same for our biodiversity. Our failure to do so as yet is why every biodiversity target and goal has been breached. What happens to our food when our insects are no longer there? Our food supply is literally challenged. We must incorporate nature capital into our economic systems, invest in it, and protect it with measurement and, yes, with transparency.
We need to mobilize private capital given the amounts of financing required. KfW as institutions and I as its CEO are extremely committed. Today, we are one of the largest global financiers, and our legacy fund, jointly initiated with the German government, is a great example. But there's a lot to do.
For many companies, it is not a question of if they integrate the protection of biodiversity into their business strategy, but how to do that. So let's make good practices known, discuss them, celebrate role models, and ask retailers and companies insistently, what are you doing?
So let's stay with the question by Nina Ruge. So what do you do? Or we could actually extend it. Why do you not do anything? What would you have to do? And this is, there is one gentleman who can explain this in detail, who has a lot of knowledge and who's also used to exceeding boundaries. We're now exceeding the boundary to economy, and he has actually crossed the border to music, and he has worked together with the Rundfunk Symphony Orchestra of Berlin, and now he's here in order to speak about the challenges for the economy. It is the WWF Director Christoph Heinrich. So crossing borders is something that we will have to clarify afterwards again. So thank you so much for the invitation, for the possibility to speak here today. You gave me a great title, and I, however, decided to provide you with a possibility for a solution, and this could also be something like a world premiere, because it is actually a new tool that we have we're officially presenting in January in the World Economic Forum, and I will do a preview today here in Frankfurt. And let's get back to the title, because it is an important question. So what do we need in order to preserve our nature, the greatest treasure that this planet has? Because we're also part of this treasure, and there is no value that could exceed biodiversity, because it is our life. Nothing can be more valuable than that. It's not possible under no circumstances. Have a religious view on it, ethical view on it, functional, monetary view. It is the highest value that this planet has. And for this reason, there cannot be any medium that would be big enough or small enough in order to preserve it. So this is one thing I wanted to mention in advance. We're a very international organization. I think it's fair to say that we are active in approximately 100 countries of this world, sometimes more, sometimes less. And we have very different experience on how to work there. And in many countries of this planet, and it's not only the poor countries, there you cannot rely on the governments the way it should be. You can't go there and tell them we have a problem with the protection of nature. Dear government, please do something. It will not work, and that is understandable. It's not as easy in our own country, so you need different actors. They have to be included in the solution. If it doesn't work with the government, how does it work then? Does it work with the streets, with mass protests? Sometimes it does, but there are other players, and the economy can be one player. This was one of the reasons that from this deep frustration of what hasn't been decided on at the Rio conference. So for this reason, the WWF started to mobilize everyone in order to protect the forests, and later, because of the deep frustration of the inability of the European Union, this all came from this deep frustration, but the inability, complete inability that our European Union had when it comes to the fish stocks. Actually, being able to tackle that and approaching it with economy, I mean, if politics cannot solve it, then the big players should do it. Unilever was one partner back then. So these were the first approaches from deep frustration and disappointment, but we also know it's not only the state who doesn't solve it. The companies can't solve it alone either, so we will always need the state, and the certification system then continued. Of course, it became kind of the DNA of the WWF, but when I look back, I have to say that in the end, it is actually still disappointing. So the expectations that we had didn't come true, so a lot more has to happen. We have leakage effects that we underestimated in terms of palm oil, and when you have high expectations, then you have very few players in there, only the organic farming companies. When you go in deep, then you have a lot of players. However, will it be possible to raise the standard so high? Then no, it didn't work the way I would have desired it to be, so it's a difficult thing. So a second thought before I go over to this world premiere. Nowadays we know from almost all scientific publications on biodiversity, let's say Leopoldina, IPBES, and also the Living Planet report, one thing is very clear. Protection of the nature can achieve a lot. So protection areas can be very successful. Also other classical tools that are often called old school can have a great effect. However, they're not sufficient. We need to bear the pressure. We need to bring the pressure. We need to withdraw it from the area, pressure that 8 billion people on this planet have. And we need to reduce the CO2 footprint by 50%. And it is possible, but it requires us to change our behavior. So how do you actually reduce the demands of consumers? And can the WWF address 8 billion consumers on this planet? Of course not. We have 1 billion agricultural producers who are actually responsible for a large part of this problem. It is the change of the utilization of land. It is the utilization of who are in charge of the implementation of resources, who carry the big responsibility for that, for the trading houses. And these were the approaches that we had in our second approach. So we had a model with consumers and producers, and in the middle there were those players that you might want to address. So large companies, large delivery chain responsibles, and we came up with a program, and maybe we can have a deeper look into that during the panel discussion later. Whether it works or not is still very open, but I think we just have to try. And today's event is a part of this approach to address the big players on the market level. However, also the level of state regulation has to participate here. I know it's not likable, but we need this instrument. The WWF Germany has a planet business approach, so this means that from the planetaries, so it is Johan Rex's approach, and there we picked 3 ecological dimensions. Sorry, I don't know what I did here. Does it have a pointer? No. You see there are human rights included, of course, climate, then also the water consumption and also biodiversity. What we see when we have transformative partnerships with companies is that climate and water is something that we've already learned a lot more, and often it is quite well anchored in a company. When you know a lot of water, you actually know the problems. So this is something we do not have to explain too often. But a couple of years with the German Development Society, we developed a water risk filter, and it is a free tool online. You do not have to pay for access, and they consult on a global basis. When you're in a particular sector and you want to promote a certain activity, then they analyze your water risks. And this tool has been accepted so well. I was actually surprised by this, to be honest, and it shows the problem. Water availability has become a large problem, and with this tool we have created a consulting tool that companies can use free of charge. And back then it was already the idea to ask ourselves whether we could achieve it with biodiversity as well, because many companies have not understood the dimension of biodiversity. I would actually say most of the companies. It is not an accusation, because the entire society hasn't understood it yet. It's not just a medium like water, it is just so wide. Everything is in there: wood, fish, birds, and so on. And also pollinators, and we took on that path, and I would like to explain this tool to you today. So 1 million of species face extinction due to human activity. We know from the society in London that publishes the Living Planet report, we know that 68%, so almost 70% of all vertebrates were lost. So this is amphibia, fish, and birds. And since then, 70% have disappeared. Before 1970, we have also lost many of them. I do not even want to know how big the loss would be if we would, for example, compare it to 1900. No one has data on that. We only have the data for 1970, and since then 70% of the animals were lost on the planet. And the other number here, the English trillion is in German a billion, but in English it is a trillion, and this is the value that is at stake every year. So this is what the World Economic Forum calculated. Is not the WWF, so it is actually a very credible number. So what do companies have to expect in the future? I predict that all of you who are entrepreneurs or who represents an enterprise, then expect that the WWF and other organizations will create a lot of pressure for you, but we will also help you and offer solutions. However, we will stand up for state regulations, for biodiversity reports, for risk assessments, for measures for compensation, for offsetting, and so on, so that there are regulations where we say stop. World Heritage Sites, for example, it can't be the case that large infrastructure projects are still done in World Heritage Sites of the UNESCO, and they even find people on the financial markets for loans for that. So these are some potential regulations and directives that will come up. So they are not very harsh, but something will come. The risks that we have are very diverse. So we have physical risks, we have the risk that what you want to use on site simply burns down. So I took this picture of fire here. You want to use wood or timber and then it burns down and the material is gone. Then the regulatory aspect, so the ability to move as a company will be limited, then reputational risks, and also the risk of resources such as water and fish. So, for example, the Baltic Sea, there the cod was almost eliminated. This is the situation that we have at the Baltic Sea, so it wasn't done properly and the resource was gone. Then there are also large opportunities. For example, there is, of course, when you agree on working with governments, communities and NGOs on site, then you have different possibilities in the different regions. There are opportunities for the markets so that you can gain trust of consumers when your own consumers stand behind it as well, and also when you have a responsible treatment of your resources, that you will be able to use it in the long term. One vision would be making people the stewards of our planet. And of course, this will always include the behavior of companies and the well-being of people and nature. The challenge for you and for all of us is that biodiversity is not so easy to grasp, and the risks are always very local. And how should you assess the biodiversity risk in a country in Africa, for example, from your office? There you will probably not know what kind of species are located there, what nature looks like there, what your investment will look like. And you also have to expect that there will soon be regulations and the resources will disappear. And I mean, this is maybe a bit far-reaching, but the solution, I would say, one of many possible solutions is this risk filter that I will explain to you in a second. We developed it so that in January it can be published officially within a partnership with the companies that you see here and the institutions that you see here, and it is supposed to be a handout for you. So in the future, when you invest, which type it is, with a self-assessment or a professional consultancy assessment, you can use this tool in order to identify investment in biodiversity risks, but it is also supposed to provide you with possible approaches for solutions. So how does the tool work? First of all, your dependencies on biodiversity will be highlighted. So if you haven't understood it yet, then the tool will hopefully help you to understand what you're actually dependent on. And then, in the end, what's also very important is also the influence on biodiversity because of your activities. And then a risk assessment will be put together, and then there will be a solution and also responses and strategies. So this is a little technical. You do not have to try to read it. I would just like to use this slide. This is a screenshot of the mask where you enter information. A colleague of WWF Germany did that. It is a Canadian colleague, Rebecca Church, and she is such a smart woman. This is why I'm mentioning her name. Actually, she should be here to present it. It would have been a lot fairer, but she will present it in January when it's official. So here you enter, how you assess, how you make your own assessment. So there are many categories. You can assess yourself, and then you can make an assessment whether you believe that you're very dependent on a particular resource and whether you believe that the influence on this resource is high or low. However, and this is what you can also have done with a consultancy company. And then there are 50 different data sets that you can understand as a question layer. So here we have 50 data sets. And I just have a couple of examples here on the right side. So the question is availability of timber. Is it actually available, hard timber, soft timber? Then the species, the threatened species, then also the condition of the fisheries, then what does it look like in terms of fertile soil? Are there any ecosystems? Then marina habitation, then we have the pollination, crop pollination, and this is an example of a world map of the protected areas. Then we have the key biodiversity areas, and the same also applies for the seas. So these are websites are concepts by biologists that said these areas are the most important ones in order to preserve nature. And then we also have social questions such as the incidence of indigenous people, and then also human rights. These are 50 in total. There are just a couple of examples on this slide. Then you have those risk scenarios, these evaluation graphs, and in the end you will then receive strategies for solutions in accordance with the cascade: avoid, reduce, restore, and transform. And it will then be a lot more detailed when it is published in January. I just wanted to show you this as a possible contribution to a solution, because I thought it's new, it's fresh. It will be the same just like the certification problems. This thing alone will not solve a lot, but what I have trust in is that at some point the numerous different approaches that build up on each other will show a solution, and this can change something on your mind. So a company can just sit down and try it out, and doing this alone is something that will already have a huge effect. Thank you so much.
So, meine Damen und Herren, der Herr Heinrich wird nicht lange verschwinden, denn er kommt jetzt gleich
ladies
zurück auf
and
die
gentlemen,
Bühne,
Mr.
weil wir
Heinrich
uns unsere
join us on
Gesprächsrunde
the
hier
stage
zusammenstellen,
shortly,
die gerade schon
because
mehrfach
we
angekündigt worden
are
ist.
going to have our podium
Heinrich werde ich dann
discussion
gleich
now.
noch mal, wenn er sich einen kleinen Moment ausgeruht hat,
After having had a short rest, Mr. Heinrich will join us again.
ob wir
Maybe
zur
let's try
Staatssekretärin
out
im
if we have a
Bundeswirtschaftsministerium und zu Frau
connection
Brandner
to Ms. Brandner, the
Verbindungen
Parliamentary
haben.
State Secretary
Das war noch so ein bisschen so wie...
in the Federal
Und
Ministry.
wir können Sie jetzt sogar sehen.
So
Wir
I
sehen
can
Ihre
hear you,
Standuhr im
and we can
Hintergrund.
even see you. We can see
Frau
your
Brandner, sowas
big
hängt da jetzt
clock
im
in the
Ministerium mittlerweile
background.
rum.
So that's the furniture you have in the ministry. No, I'm not in the ministry anymore.
Das haben wir fast angenommen, dass das so ist.
We almost assumed this would be the case. My great-great-grandfather was a clockmaker. So you could actually repair it on your own. Well, I know generally how a clock works. Thank you, Ms. Brandner. This is very good for testing our connection. We have a very short delay. And let's give you the applause of the Frankfurt public audience.
So, jetzt darf ich zwei Vertreter zu uns bitten.
Now I would like to ask two representatives to join us. They are representatives from international economy. First of all, Managing Director of Sustainability at Procter & Gamble, Gabriele Hessing. Thank you for joining us.
Und der CEO der Bank BNP Paribas.
And I would also like to invite the CEO of BNP Paribas to join us.
Und neben Ihnen nimmt Herr Heinrich Platz, der gerade für uns
Mr. Heinrich will sit down next to you. Thank you to you as well. Mr. Dietrich, let's start with you. You've already did something similar that we've just seen. So what does your bank offer when it comes to facts and figures? Maybe you can tell us what exactly you did. Well, first of all, we had a look at all of our portfolios. And a few years ago, we decided that we want to leave the tobacco industry totally. So our customers don't have any assets anymore in the tobacco industry. Then in 2020, we decided that we want to be coal-free for all our clients by 2030. This was big news because status quo from politicians is that we want to get out of the coal industry by 2038, but we can even do this quicker. So we said we want to see an exit plan for the year 2030, and if you cannot present it to us, or if it isn't plausible for us, then we won't finance you in the coming 10 years, and after that we also won't finance them. So let me ask you, how did people react? Well, first of all, as you can imagine, those weren't fun talks. We had a lot of supporters, and I was very happy about the fact that 2 or 3 weeks ago, the RWE said that they want to be coal-free by 2030. So they followed us. Mr. Brandner, are you relieved when you hear that the industry, the companies are doing it all by themselves, so you don't need to get to do any work? Well, as has already been said, it's always a cooperation between all the different areas, and we hope that our regulations will help the companies achieve their goals. So in the end, cooperation is what's most important, and our ministry was also an important actor when it came to the coal exit, and if you work together, then you can achieve the goal much quicker. But Mr. Schenk earlier talked about the failure of politics. So how does this really work when it comes to legislation? If Mr. Dietrichs can have serious talks, then so can you. Let me tell you, in my experience, serious and vicious talks don't go anywhere. We also need to highlight what the new chances and possibilities are of these new technologies and what happens if we don't go this way. And this is also the goal that we want to achieve, to see what we could achieve. It starts with the resource usage and also the consumption. It's always related to nature, and we also need to consider costs. And I believe that there are great possibilities when we say that there is nothing that can substitute these resources on the one hand, and on the other hand, to also show solutions how we can achieve this goal, that there are some goals that can be used in a cycle. So there are not only risks when it comes to this topic, but also possibilities. You mentioned it earlier, if you want to have a real cycle economy, where we treat our resources much better, then we need to make sure that there are regulations to support these decisions. For example, for the Batteries Act, where the recycling and the reusage is already planned in from the very start. So it's important that we need to offer solutions for using a cycle economy so that we don't have to use as many resources anymore. There are also a lot of other initiatives. Maybe let's stay with raw material usage. Then we can see that, of course, there are a lot of technologies that are expensive at first, but that are worth the investment. And lastly, because you talked about the biodiversity, we have put in our new commercial agenda that biodiversity will also be one part of the implementable elements. So for us, it's important that we do not only have the Paris agreements in there, but also other goals. Thank you, Ms. Brandner. However, we need to say goodbye now because our connection is a bit slow. But I was very happy to have you here on board and talk to you. I know that you are very busy, so thank you very much for taking this time to join us. She is a very influential politician, and she's not the only one, because soon we will talk with Bettina Stark-Watzinger. We are in your favorite city, Frankfurt.
Und ich würde mir jetzt erlauben, weil hier Sie hören, heißt das, Sie hören nichts oder heißt das, Sie haben sehr schöne Ohren und wollen darauf hinweisen? Sie hören mich nicht. Ja gut, dann müssen wir es gleich mit Zeichen- oder Gebärdensprache versuchen. Frau Stark-Watzinger, wir reden hier weiter vor uns hin. Wir haben schon schwere Worte. Jetzt, ja, hören Sie die Stimme?
Jetzt höre ich Sie. Hallo, guten Abend nach Frankfurt. Ja, ich sehe alles wunderbar.
Yes, I can see everything. Perfect. Ms. Stark-Watzinger, we've already heard about a political failure today, and when it comes to biodiversity, we always have these images, a river in Africa, antelopes that are feeding. So how can you make sure that the people and the public also realize that climate change and biodiversity are connected?
Ja, das ist eine sehr umfassende Frage. Also ich glaube, ich predige hier zu den schon Konvertierten, wie man so schön sagt, zu den Gläubigen, dass natürlich das die Grundlage von so vielem ist, also von unserer Gesundheit.
It's the basis of everything for our health, our animals, and that are very important, but also for medicine. It's the whole range of areas. We need to communicate this broadly, that it goes hand in hand. It is also very interesting to see which value it actually has, and we know that these so-called value chains also contain more than 100 or are worth more than 125 billion US dollars. So this is a value that is touchable. I would also like to highlight that it is so important because it can promote innovation. I was in the Museum for Natural Sciences, and you can see these insects that are put on a stick in the collections, and they are digitalized. And once they are digitalized, we can use them. Why is this useful? For example, if you need a syringe for having vaccinations, then you don't want to feel it, so you have a look at insects that you don't really feel. You have a look at their anatomy and their stingers. And all in all, we need to be smart when it comes to investigation, to research, and also to political platforms. So Professor Vogel is also part of the Frankfurt Declaration, and he said that it also happens outside of nature. How can you put the price on nature, and what does politics have anything to do with it? Of course, we do research for a lot of topics. For example, the maintenance of biodiversity. There are a lot of different approaches. There's one project that's about assessing and reporting the economic value, but it's also all about giving advice to cities and towns, for example, how they can, how cities should look like in order to preserve biodiversity. What should houses or flats look like? Which materials should be used? Maybe think about what our research institutes are doing in the North Sea. They are trying to repopulate seagrass so that it can contain more CO2. And we need to really look at individual cases so that we can showcase the value. It's also all about green tech, and I'm very happy that this awareness has come into the public minds. Do you believe that this transition has already been finished? No, of course not. It's still there, and we can. However, we haven't done enough yet. We need to keep investing so that we have a better understanding, but also in countermeasures, so that we can make sure that we will have more biodiversity by using technology. And as we've said before, climate change and biodiversity go hand in hand. So you also need to realize that this is something that we need to work on an international level. And therefore, I'm really happy that our federal government is working on international panels. And scientists can also give good advice to politicians. So if you ask me, have we done enough already? No, we haven't, but we have made a good start. How about legislation, obligatory legislation, so that no company can do everything that they want? Well, of course, we need a basic legislation. For example, the certificate trade, a certain framework. Of course, that's very important that we develop these legal framework structures, because nature is a common good that needs to be protected, because otherwise it might be destroyed without anyone having to pay for it. Okay, so what can we expect when it comes to these topics, such as water usage, land usage, and so on? Well, of course, this topic is discussed at our cabinet table with all kinds of different ministries. And it's also important to have events and conferences such as this one that we are having now, to understand that it is that we need to work on this topic in order to maintain our prosperity and well-being. Ms. Stark-Watzinger, I know that you are very busy, and I'm very happy that you took the time for us and that you are so relaxed here. I believe it's because we're here in Frankfurt, where you come from. And thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Ms. Hessig, what is it like for you, Procter & Gamble? $66.4 trillion annual turnover. We know it from Oil of Olaf, for those of you who use it. So, and Bitrix as well. That is a while ago. That's over already. Okay, I just looked into the previous thing. I think you also sold the Punica Oasis, but that's so long ago. For several decades, we haven't had any food products, but I've been with Procter for 32 years, so I still know the Punica Oasis. So, Ms. Hendricks already said it. I already came up with a picture in my mind about mafia, so leaving the area of kale, of brown coal. So what is it like for you? what do you do at Procter & Gamble? So first of all, what does Procter & Gamble do? What do they do? You know us from your own home, because we are part of daily work at home. So Ariel or Pampers or Gillette, you might have washed your hair with Pantene. We are part of people's daily life, and it is our target to make daily life for people better. It is about product performance, but not only today, also for future generations. And this brings us to the topic. If we want to be successful tomorrow, we have to face the topics. There is no way getting around. And this is just what's important. And this topic is what we haven't only been dealing with since yesterday, as Mr. Heinrich said. So, for example, it was important to proceed when it comes to climate targets. Our first decade goals or aims were set in 2010, and they were actually quite helpful because we can measure against them and report on them. So transparency is very important, but we have scientific targets when we look at the different pillars. They have been named by Christoph Heinrich as well. Climate is one, circular economy is one, water is one. And in these areas, we also often have clear targets, not only from our side, also on the market. It is clearly defined what it is about. The last kid on the block, if I may say it like that, is the topic of nature. This is the youngest pillar, and it is also the pillar where we have already set targets. But regarding the target structure, we are not as developed as in terms of climate targets. And for this reason, I believe it is important to follow up on the work that Christoph Heinrich introduced when it comes to those clear targets, because this is what we need for our future collaboration. So you do not know how much nature you attack or you utilize in order to run your business. I wouldn't call it like that. I wouldn't call it that. Of course, it all starts with responsible delivery chains. This is what we're familiar with, and this is what we will report on. But as it was mentioned before by Mr. Scheng as well, in the entire area of biodiversity, there is, of course, a lot that we have to learn. It does not mean that we're resting, but there is also the positive twin. So, for example, one target is for the decade 2020 to 2030, so the decade we're currently in, all emissions that we cannot reduce. Of course, we start with a reduction, we have the target here, but we need to cut it by half, and something is left over. And for these emissions that have not been reduced or couldn't be reduced, for those we need a compensation based on climate protection solutions. And this also contributes to biodiversity, and we learn a lot during those projects that work for WWF or Conservation National, and then you learn a lot more about biodiversity. And I believe without that work, we wouldn't have had the target yet. And in December, we will publish the next report. I've already had a look at it. I'm just not allowed to speak about it in the way Mr. Heinrich did, but I know that a nature target has been defined, and I believe that we will continue with that. So what would you like to tell Procter & Gamble to do immediately? So this is Gabi Hessig, and we know each other, so that she's here was actually, well, not, I wasn't informed about that, but there's a relationship to Procter & Gamble, and this is why I know a lot more about P&G than I would actually know about a different company. So we're out there in public. We have a recommendation for simple washing procedures for the washing machine, so the programs of the washing machine. It actually fits quite well to a fall where we will have to save energy. We're also evaluating to wash laundry at 30 degrees. So we can do that with almost everything. And I always thought when laundry is very dirty or stained, and if it could be unhygienic, then it would be 60 degrees. My wife would actually put the temperature up, but my standard thing was always 40 degrees. I wash a lot on my own. This was the standard, and this is waste of energy. It's not required. The modern washing agents, they just wash everything at 30 degrees, actually even at 20 degrees. And it is a lot of energy. What was it? 30, Gabby, it was 38% energy reduction. When you just go that down, then it's 80% of energy saving. So you would probably say it's peanuts, but there are billions of washing programs in Germany, and when we work together with Procter & Gamble, this is what we're using as communication. You might find it well, you might find it small, but we wouldn't do that if we wouldn't require a lot more from P&G. They have a long-term water partnership with the WWOS, because water is a huge topic. We have heralded that, but that is what the WWF US has been doing with P&G for a while. And we also looked in palm oil, and this was one of the main drivers for the deforestation in Asia. And a company such as P&G does not have to even think about it when they want to enter in such conversation without speaking about those topics. This is what we're not communicating about, but this is transformation, and P&G is one of those 100 companies, and it is a very big company, and when we address their resource streams, then we might move something. And it is a nice example, and I'm so glad that Gabby is here, because then we can clarify a couple of things. Aren't you SBTI as well? So, Science-Based Target Initiative, climate protection in accordance with Paris, that is very hard, and WWF is also subject to that. Our colleagues were neglected when we worked on that. So what is about our flying behavior internationally? This is something what we do not really speak about a lot. So we're just speaking about reducing from 40 to 30%. So it is a Paris-compatible approach. Palm oil and water is very important for them. And in the future, probably biodiversity transformation, and the example of a large company. And in order to make it possible, we also, and that's actually correct to do so, this is what we want to achieve as well. So we have to work on other solutions, and I'm always so happy that we have managed to bring the Product Supply Innovation Center to Kronberg. We just spoke about local patriotism, and that's so important. These are all our global colleagues that deal with our 200 factories, and this is factor 10 when you consider the suppliers. And there we work on water on the one hand. You explained it very well, what it means for companies when you are in a area that doesn't have a lot of water, then you can produce. So this is important for the enterprises, and then the colleagues deal with that in total, and of course also in the arid areas, and they also deal with zero emission in production. It is a global team that is around, and they are also here because they are the critical heads, because there are NGOs like WWF and others that challenge us, and also because people from bankers to other investors, they say ESG targets are great, they need to be delivered, and they need to be transparent. And I believe that this actually creates the whole picture, and this is why the work with colleagues just like Mr. Heinrichs from the WWF is so important also in the US. It's important that he challenges us all the time. So if I was very rich, Mr. Diederichs, could you tell me how to become rich with biodiversity as an investor? I would like to say something about market failure first. Mr. Schenk said it is used very often, so that people say we got into the situation because the markets failed. But I would actually say there was no market, there was no pricing for the damage of nature, of air, of water. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to produce T-shirts in Bangladesh and sell them for 2 euros in Germany, or to fly with cheap airlines for 19 euros something to other European cities. It wouldn't have been possible if we had priced those damages. And Mrs. Stark-Watzinger also said it. Of course, with certificate trading, we could find solutions in order to heal that, to give it a certain price, an appropriate price, and in order to come closer to the targets that we have set. So let's get back to your question. The question was not raised in the right way. When a company invests in biodiversity, so someone who invests and does not pay attention to biodiversity, then they will lose everything, because there will not be a business model for that in the future. It's a big topic for us. When companies do not care about biodiversity, I mean, you have a growing resistance within society, and you also have a lack of acceptance by society against those principles, against companies that do not pay attention to those principles. And I think there's a taxonomy that we also need. Every company has an intrinsic motivation to work on those topics. Companies cannot afford it. The reputation of a company is damaged so quickly. If you do not believe in the targets, then you should at least protect your company's reputation, and I believe we should do both. Of course, as an investor, you can make money with biodiversity. 3 years ago, everyone asked the question and everyone said you can't make money with ESG. When you publish green-labeled bonds, then they most of the times have a better pricing than if they compared to non-green labeled bonds. So acceptance by society will lead to the event that companies have to move into that direction. And of course, we have to see that in our credit portfolios, we do not have companies that do not take care of it. Every day I have conversations with medium-sized German companies, and there is no one who hasn't identified the relevance of that. With ESG, we are actually further than biodiversity, but this has to do with communication as well. We have to make sure that we bring biodiversity to the same awareness level as soon as possible. And it came from you. There are no biodiversity measures that are harmful for climate. However, there are climate-friendly actions that can harm biodiversity. For example, you mentioned hydropower before, and this is why we are actually promoting that. We are intensively dealing with the biodiversity topic in order to also make sure that we invest into companies that are in line with those principles. When you say it, there's actually reason for hope. So compared to what those two gentlemen said in the beginning of the event. So I will not disagree. I wouldn't have assumed they're so optimistic. I do see the perception of biodiversity in general, and this is why I'm not making any general accusation to companies. The awareness is just very low, and also the term is not understood, and it is also unknown. And by the way, also knowledge on the different species has become very weak. So I believe that there are people who cannot actually name a simple bird. So, for example, a male blackbird, it is black and it has an orange beak. And for example, I know that from my friends. I'm in the garden, and then there is a blackbird. There is a blackbird, and then it has an orange beak. And I do have friends who do not know that. I would actually say a sparrow, for example. It's not that easy to identify a sparrow because there are many gray birds that there are many birds that look like sparrows. However, when you, for example, deal with, like, for example, the warblers, then they all look like sparrows. However, they are not sparrows. So it doesn't matter. I'm not as optimistic, but I'm very happy to see that it is seen in this way, and I would just like to leave it like that. So back to you. I had a different thought before. Is there pricing for everything? I didn't understood it like that. So may I say something about the pricing? It would, of course, be very beneficial for nature if there were prices and markets. And also when it comes to human behavior in land utilization. So the right incentive systems would actually bring a lot. And the European agricultural politics their targets have not been set correctly in the past. So in the past we had their production of food was supported, then this created a lot of butter and milk, and it was just not, there was no incentive on what should be done on this area or this piece of land. And I would like to set some incentive systems for those types, because this is just how humans work. When people get money for producing a certain thing, then they will just do it. But there's even an additional dimension, which relates to behavioral changes. So these are value systems of a society. I would like to mention one example that always comes to my mind when I think about the value of biodiversity, or to put it differently, when we try to set a value for nature, then it's kind of a trap, because we will all the time be at the point that in the end this precise forest might not be as profitable as the palm oil production. So what do we do then? What do we do if we, for example, had the Library of Alexandria? I think this is one of the biggest phantom pains of culture. When this was burned down, if we still had it, and then there is an investor who comes in and says, what a useless thing. I will just build a parking garage or a Tesla factory. Let's take the Tesla factory. Ecologically, economically, it would win by far. So why should we then have the Library of Alexandria? It's the values of a society, so no one would have doubt for a second that the Library of Alexandria would be a million times the value of the Tesla factory. No matter how many workplaces it would create, it wouldn't compete with it. Just like the crown jewelries in London, the value of the gold is quite low. However, if the British government, if they had a household crisis, would they sell the jewels? They would never do that. We don't know that yet. I'm waiting for your thesis. But we're burning nature. And I said it before, life itself for nothing with a match. So this is what happens in areas of this, in the Amazonian areas. It is our lowest capital. It is a match that is enough in order to set the forest on fire when there is a drought, and then you just wait for the rain to come in, and then the ash goes into the soil, and then you can grow grass and grow cattle there. And compared to this, the Library of Alexandria is just a minor thing. So for example, what you wanted to say is BNP Paribas wouldn't give you money to turn the Library of Alexandria into a parking garage. No, you wouldn't receive money from us, and the next day you would be ruined, to be honest. So I understand what you wanted to clarify, the comparison. Library Alexandria, no one would survive that, no investor would survive that, because it would be unacceptable for society. Yes, that's the problem, or the psychological problem is, and you're actually right about it, is that the the ruining of the library would be a one-off event, and biodiversity is something that creeps in. So demography is one of the most underestimated problems in Germany. Why do we not speak about it? Because there is no one-off effect. It creeps in, and it is the same with biodiversity. And this is more difficult to get it onto people's minds compared to the one-off event of the destruction of the library in Alexandria. And I still have a thought. The library in Alexandria did not lead to the loss of a lot of knowledge. So it was probably not as absolute as possible. So the entire knowledge of the world has not been lost completely. I believe that the loss wasn't as total when it comes to the loss of biodiversity, and what makes it so fatal and unique is that it is based that it will not be possible to restore it in millions of years, and just people who are cynic find solace in that. So the loss of biodiversity cannot be recovered. This only works through evolutionary processes, and it works. However, this will not bring any more solace. But if it's solid, when you go to the Marianengraben, and from every bacteria that is in there, another flora and fauna would actually develop again. But none of our grandchildren would actually experience that. So, and what I wanted to mention is I wanted to say that not only the ecological view will help us, we need to make sure that at some point the rainforest has the same value, ethical value, religious value, just like the Library of Alexandria.
I agree with you, but I believe it's easier to explain them that the loss of the rainforest is a big economical problem. That's easier than to explain that it's an ecological problem. Well, if people understand it in any way, I don't care which way.
Das eine sage ich Ihnen noch, ja, und wenn Sie aber, deswegen haben Sie jetzt das Schlusswort, Sie wollen aber auch noch Geld verdienen.
Ms. Hessing, you have the final word. After all, we also want to earn money because it's getting too holy for me now. Of course we want to earn money, and that's also our job as a company, also in the interest of our shareholders, which, by the way, are normal people like you and me. Procter & Gamble, and the owners of Procter & Gamble are just normal people like you and me that have their pension funds with us. And this is a very central aspect, because therefore it is extremely important that we can also show our owners and the interested stakeholders of any kind that we do not only have an 85-year-old history, but that we are also well equipped for the next 20 to 30 years. And I can only do that if I have a good team and a good basis. So for me, there is no controversy anymore. I believe that also in discussions, people are trying to find some artificial discussions and controversies. But however, it needs to go hand in hand. Business success needs to be sustainable, and this is possible. So we need to continue finding the best solutions. However, it is no controversy. We can only be successful if we also care about all these biodiversity criteria. That's what I wanted to add earlier. In order to move this discussion forward, we need events like this one today. We need collaborations and new cooperations, because only this way we have these many different opinions and views and can also implement them. But this is only possible if we come together and work together. This is my optimism that we can tackle these big problems the best way if we do it together. I just want to add one more thing. You also have to do this is to gain young professionals for your company, because young, well-trained professionals will only be willing to work for us if we have believable concepts. So this measure is also very important for us to generate new talents, to attract new talents. We need to show them a value framework. Economic aspects are not the decisive factor for young people. Thank you very much for this very passionate discussion to the three of you. Thank you very much. As you have all noticed, we are not satisfied at all. Of course, this was a very optimistic discussion, but we've got the Frankfurt Declaration that actually is based on the community that we have here today. And two very competent experts will explain to you what the Frankfurt Declaration is, what it contains. It's the executive of the Future Institute for Sustainable Transformation, Tobias Rachel. Please join us. And we've also got the General Director of the Zoological Research Center, and also, however, in his stead, Mr. Bernhard Miesow, the General Director of the Leibniz Institute, is here. Thank you very much, Jörg. Ladies and gentlemen, we want to present to you the Frankfurt Declaration today. We published it this morning, and I just checked up. 166 people have already signed it. Maybe some of you will also join us after this evening, after what we have developed jointly. The Frankfurt Declaration is our common position paper, our joint position paper of leading researchers, scientists, economists, and also NGOs. And as you can imagine, we had very heated discussions in the past few months, because all these actors had a very different view on this topic, and we tried to find a joint way into the future. And we also wanted to answer the question, what has to happen so the companies can contribute in a positive manner when it comes to resolving the loss of diversity. The goal of our declaration is to have a lot of people supporting us, and that representatives from politics, science, and also society will support us. We've also made 6 offers where we want to help. I want to actively help with the implementation of our claims. So let me explain them to you a bit more in detail. Our first demand is to have uniform competition conditions for companies, which means that we need a smart regulation, a smart sustainability regulation, especially when it comes to biodiversity. We don't have this yet, and this leads to the fact that there is no pressure on companies to have a closer look at this topic. On the other hand, this regulation also helps us create a clear and standardized framework for the companies so they know which steps to take. We want that this regulation leads to the fact that nature-positive economic activities are standard. Our second demand is to have uniform standards and mandatory biodiversity reporting by companies. That's a demand that you could assume comes mainly from scientists or NGOs, but only 2 weeks ago there was an initiative of 330 companies from all over the world that said we want to have a mandatory biodiversity reporting because we also want to have this transparency. We want to have a level playing field, and we want to make sure that companies have to report on the fact how they impact nature, both positively and negatively. Our third demand is the immediate elimination of monies that are damaging for the environment. We need to do the exact opposite of what's happening today. There are a lot of subsidies that go into the wrong way. We need to preserve the nature and not destroy it. Our fourth demand is to make sure that we have supply chains that don't contain deforestation. We need to look at this topic over the whole range of the supply chain. It doesn't work only doing something within our own company grounds, but we need to make sure that our supply chains are, for example, free of deforestation, and that this is implemented even still this year. Our fifth demand is to make sure that the 30-30 goal is taken and validated. This is one of the big aims that we want to achieve at COP15 in Montreal. We also want to take the Frankfurt Declaration with us to Montreal to discuss it there, and we also want to put pressure on all of the participants to make sure that it's also part of the big goals of COP15. And last but not least, we want to introduce biodiversity into strategic research and innovation agenda. We have national climate goals that are measurable. However, we do not have these goals for biodiversity, but we need them. These are our 6 demands that we have developed jointly. And we also have some ideas how we can implement them. So I'd like to hand over to my colleague now.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is very clear we can require a lot, but we as science have to deliver so that these requirements can be implemented and that they are also applicable. What we thought about things that can be offered from the science side, and these are our 6 offers which mirror the requirements that we have determined. And the offer is the following: elaboration of a measurement logic for nature-positive economies. What does that mean? As long as we cannot tell what we require, so for example, how can nature-positive or biodiverse structure be measured at all? As long as we can't measure, we're having a problem. So this means that we as science, we need to elaborate or develop a mechanism for the measurement. Very important offer from the side of science from our point of view. Secondly, you've said it before, there is a huge amount of subsidies that are harmful for nature, and from science we need a development of the paths in order to determine how it can be done and how it can be done in a reasonable way. And here we also need knowledge-based solutions for a apportionment of those subsidies, and there we still have to perform as science. Then we also need to extend global biodiversity monitoring programs. You might not come up with the answer to why that would be important. Without monitoring of biodiversity, we cannot measure the impact of certain measures or we cannot attest it. So this closes the circle. This is why we need monitoring programs in a global context, because biodiversity doesn't know any borders, and they would have to be set up in a systemized way. So here, Germany, once again, from science side, has a debt that they still have to fulfill. So maybe the new Center of Biodiversity Monitoring might not be known to you because it was published, or it was established on the requirement of the BMU and another partner, and this can be a model which can serve global monitoring networks as well. That's very important. It is also very important to mention that Germany is so important on an international basis. We are exemplary in terms of monitoring. We have been doing that for the past 10 years, and this is something that is not available in many other European countries. The fourth point is also very important. It is the establishment of a global and publicly accessible biodiversity database. So there are many different databases. We've heard a lot about it, but in the end of the day, it is required that this enormous amount of knowledge that comes from biodiversity science and research needs to be available to others. Once again, Germany, as one of the big industrial nations of the world, Germany has the obligation to share that, and we have that big tradition as well. All the German museums have the largest collection of biodiversity worldwide. So it's very important to generate databases, to include collections that are available in museums, and this is why it's so important to deliver this biodiversity assessment and the basis for it. Fifth is making best practices visible for nature-positive procedures, and we need to confess that we do not know in many cases how nature-positive economization can look like, and it is important that we collaborate in order to establish role models and in order to service them and to understand what is possible and what's not possible and to which effect we can achieve effects and in which not. And it's once again important that we collaborate here. And the sixth is the encouragement from science to invest in companies, funds, or initiatives that invest in biodiversity. And once again, the public sector has set up certain measures. However, what we want to focus on and what science can also offer is to use means in a way that they help mobilizing private financial means. There is the Legacy Landscapes Fund, which is one of the best examples of how something like that can work. And with this offer, we actually also think about the mirror of the demand or requirement of politics. So Germany can become the biodiversity pioneer, and we should also be ready to do so. And so far, we believe that those requirements and these requirements and also these offers can lead to the event that we have a transformation in terms of public perception and also the pressure that we need to set up in Montreal in order to achieve something. And we also need to take over responsibility in order to achieve nature-positive economizing. Thank you so much. So, this is Frankfurt calling out to the world. If that was Super Bowl, then the canvas would go down and then we would sing the song of the Frankfurt call out. But of course, we are reminded that such an evening for support is very important. We have the great event here, but we also have to mention that there was a big donation made by a KfW. So, as you mentioned, in terms of Jaguar, KfW proved to be the most charismatic bank in Germany. Thank you so much for the support. Some of you are laughing. Don't you think so? We called it conclusion here, and I just realized that I'm telling you what you've already read, except from those of you who have a very bad vision. For those of you, Mr. Khan, if you could now balance for us and summarize and guide us to the rest of the evening in a very inspiring way. So, Mr. Kranen, the stage is yours. So that's a lamp, right? Yes. So, I may give you the conclusion. It's a special honor. You saw it during the introduction. I come from the Leibniz Institute for Financial Research. It's also a Leipzig-based institute. It is almost the first time that we do something together. Mr. Tockner from Senckenberg and we from the Leibniz Institute. There's a lot to come, I believe, in particular after today's topic. And I would like to give you another perspective from the financial side and economic side. And I would like to start with a quote by a different author. So Faust, who is on his own, says, "The message is what I hear, but I do not have the belief." And this is my conclusion. There are so many good approaches. We have exemplary companies here, maybe we have two here, and I do not believe that this is the solution of the problem, and for this reason it is important that we proceed with the Frankfurt requirement and also the offer that we have. We are the safe part of the team of authors, and we need to highlight once again what it is about from an economic point of view. When we want to achieve the depth and the wideness, then the protection of biodiversity has to be the single one strategy that wins biodiversity. So no gains maximization may not be the case. This destroys the world. No, that's not true. We need to create a world that is set up for the preservation of biodiversity, and we cannot expect companies to dedicate themselves towards biodiversity in a way that harms their investors and customers. And this is a completely different approach. And three things are important for that. They're also included in the explanation. First of all, we need to know what we mean. So how do we measure biodiversity? The most important thing is that we do not know it. There is no measurement technology. Unfortunately, I didn't write down his name. Mr. Heinrich. Yes, it was Mr. Heinrich. You said 50 different data sets you put together in order to measure biodiversity, and every other participant here could add even more, and then everyone measures something else, and everyone can report how great they're doing in terms of biodiversity, and everyone has their own measurement basis. The agreement on a measurement basis is something that we cannot just say, let's hand it over to some technicians. No. A certain measurement will make some companies poor and others rich, and we need a political agenda for that. We need to define the metrics. We will participate in that, We will accompany you with a critical eye from financial economists. Is it hard enough? Is it transparent enough? Because what we do not want to know is having a world where we all speak about biodiversity. However, it is a maximum greenwashing. And we can only do that with clear structures. So I believe that this process will be very difficult. So for this reason, this needs to be a call, and only if we have the metrics, then we can come in with regulations, because otherwise you regulate everything, but you do not know what you can achieve because you do not have the metrics you can measure against. You can't measure whether it was achieved, slightly achieved, or not achieved at all. And regulation also has to make use of these metrics. It may not use anything else, because otherwise the system won't work. Regulation, the framework issued by the state, is the most important thing about politics for biodiversity, and there politics is required and not the companies. There are always some of them who are great and others are not, and in total nothing is achieved.
So we need to stop with this voluntarism. We need rules. And the third point is funding. What's the role of the financial industry, of banks and so on? They don't need their own biodiversity policy, in my own opinion. They simply need to direct their financial resources to areas where biodiversity is protected. That's my opinion. There's a lot of capital, a lot of money needed, but the money is always there when the regulation is right. So the whole financing comes along with the regulation. If the regulation is done well, financing is not a problem. That's what we are working on good, well-developed financial markets, pension systems, well-preserved banks. That's our homework that we usually do, or our daily business that we do in our organization. First of all, we need to measure, analyze, and then have the funding. So this is maybe a small reminder of the central messages of our declarations that should be at the base of everything. And that's how I would like to end this conference, and I would like to ask all of you to join us in the dinosaur room, where you can see what biodiversity looked like quite a long time ago, and maybe we can also talk about how we can preserve it for the future. So thank you to all of you, the Senckenberg Institute. It was a very successful evening.